as I just said, I'm going to talk about a wide range of stuff, and hopefully I'll kind of manage to avoid boring you and getting too deep, but also hopefully avoid just dancing on the surface of things. But in putting this talk together, I realised that my kind of methodology of bumbling into things and not really having a plan.
Sorry, Patrick, 2 seconds. I'm just getting some messages from people saying that they're struggling to hear.
Okay.
I'm not struggling to hear, but
How's that?
are other people having difficulties? Could you put something in the chat box if you are?
Shall I? Is that better if I speak like that?
Yeah, I think you can speak a bit louder, but it's fine for me.
Yeah. Okay, let's give it a go.
Okay. So as I was saying, this kind of ad hoc, not really having a master plan idea of finding your way through things has a long tail, a long history, and is a kind of methodology in itself. I've realised the image you're looking at is the cover of issue 5 of the Joker, which will come out at the end of June as planned and will be printed, and it breaks the tradition of the other copies. It has a painting on the cover as a kind of mark of the strange times that we live in. And these are the 4 previous issues of the Joker. They come out twice a year, the summer and winter solstice. And I realised that there was a period when I was teaching at the CAS about a decade or so ago, when Florian Bagel and Phil Christo were very much the kind of heart and soul of the place, where the students began to make books, and that was because the CAS was a kind of strange structure, I think, in that the teaching of history and theory was embedded in the studio culture, as was the teaching of technology and construction. And students produced an integrated design study, which was a book, like a dissertation. And the culture was that the first semester's work was design research, and then there was design realization after Christmas. And so the opportunity for master's students to begin to dip their toe into both a kind of hermeneutics of interpretation, but also developing a graphic language which would enable them to read buildings, was very much the ethos in the department at the time. And so this is what inside one of the books looks like. This is a long section through Somerset House, and along with that type of analytical drawing, we were encouraging people to make things. And so these are cast models of the facades of the various parts of Somerset House. And they were also doing a form of art history, if you like, readings of the sculptures on the buildings. And this is another piece of work looking at St George's Bloomsbury and the kind of latent presence of this perfect cube and its symbolic meaning as something that mediated between the material and the ethereal, or the role that light plays in the symbolism of religion, obviously. And these are drawings of Sir John Soane's house as a ruin, and an idea that after his wife had died and his sons had abandoned him, that he would kind of wander around. It's best seen half drunk at midnight by candlelight. And so there was that kind of work going on, which is kind of difficult, I guess, to see how that's directly related to design. But then as we refined our method, the following year I was teaching with Alan Jones and then with Paolo Moreira, who was part of the PhD seminar with Peter Carl and others. We're looking not only at the relationship between technology, road engineering, buried nature in the previous year it was the River Fleet that had been canalised in the 19th century. But the effect of 20th century road engineering on cities, and even cities seemingly as intact as Porto, suffered a lot from that. And Alvaro Caesar had worked on a number of these projects. And so on the students' own initiative, they interviewed Alvaro, and I wasn't there, Alan wasn't there, Paolo was there, he was interpreting. And they transcribed the interview, and because of course it's impossible as an architect really to kind of just talk, they were drawing, Caesar was drawing, sorry, and the collating this into a publication. And we were looking at, this is a project by master plan by Tavora to deal with the docks moving out of Porto to Matosinhos, the new dock road cutting off an ancient monastic farmstead from the water, and the this is partly history, timeline, partly drawings, surveying, and then looking at certain particular situations, the cranes in the background, when viewed from Tavora's tennis court there at rest on a Sunday, imitating the classical figures of the Baroque architecture of the other gates, and once again looking at the symbolism of the various sculptures in relationship to the modern architecture. So, and this is a festival of Senhor de Matosinhos, who's a kind of pagan version of Saint Sebastian, and who's the patron saint of fishermen, and Caesar's drawing. So there's a kind of continuity between academic work, instinct, physical labour, and design propositions. And this is a chapel designed by a very bright student called Kieran Brash for the festival of where the kind of sea god and the Christian saint commingle in this festival. And this is a 1:20 scale model. So there's this kind of situatedness, history, taking modern history very seriously, not in a way in which what one is used to doing is saying, well, this is the work of an individual genius, or this is a particular style, or this represents this or that ideology, but very, very close observation. So if you like, hermeneutics and phenomenology are involved together, both in an aesthetic way, but also in terms of participation and kind of talking to people about why they were designing things. So this is this wonderful project by Paolo Providencia for a bathhouse in the centre of town, built into the old wharfs in the quays going down to the River Douro, for people without washing machines. That enabled us then to invite Paolo to London to talk about the project. So there's kind of back and forth going on between public events, interviews, a film, a book, and these physical models. This was halfway through the academic year, where research and design are kind of coming together. And this is work from this is a kind of large model of the centre of the city of Porto, and then zooming in on fragments of things being produced by students alone. Whilst this was going on, as I mentioned, there was a weekly PhD seminar. I can see Jane Klossik in the background, who was part of that. And a very wide range of people working on different types of topics. Maurice Mitchell students looking at sites in India, and my own work, which had started at Cambridge with Peter Carr and Delaware Vesley into the Baroque city, had kind of migrated into looking at these modern projects by Tavora and Caesar. Incidentally, discovering that Tavora had, always been delivering a lecture course to first years about the history of Baroque gardens. And then following on from that, I made a series of books. The Cambridge MPhil became this small book published in Germany. It's a very alienating process. You sent them a PDF that you had a choice of covers. It's black and white. It's like most academic books. It's not very tactile. It's not very pleasurable, and it's quite expensive. And then Artifice, which was an imprint of Black Dog, asked us if we would like to make a book. They said, we're finishing a book with O'Donnell and Toomey, and we're about to do one with Jamie Faubert, and we'd like to do a book with you, which was a bit like being invited to a kind of, the Cosby, Stills, Nash and Young in the bar, and do you fancy a game of pool? It was kind of very difficult to say no. until you realise that what you really need to do is put your hand in your pocket and give them about 15 grand. Bizarrely, though, that's actually how academic publishing works as well. You apply for a research grant, some of it's for your travel expenses and research assistants' salaries, but also if you want to publish a book with lots of illustrations, you need to pay often out of your own pocket for copyright. So this was a much more pleasurable experience than having worked with an academic press. And so the juxtaposition of imagery and text was a delight to be physically involved with, sitting next to in this case actually, Portuguese graphic designers. And this is a combination of student work, our students' work, and our own work. And I made this discovery that the kind of digital memory of iPhoto, which is now the cloud, obviously meant that you could, if you were kind of seeking the moment at which you'd made a sketch, what would be revealed to you was where you were, where you'd made the sketch. So we were in Venice, Claudia and I, for a Biennale, and unbeknownst to me, my subconscious had registered that there was a relationship between a south-facing, thick, deep stone facade on a grand boulevard, if you will, with figures on the skyline of a very civic nature that situated the domestic space of the loggia or balcony in between the private territory of the individual and the city. And so this kind of collage approach, which became the theme of the book, really, mimesis being something that means both memory and imagination, and something physical, a plant that tracks the sun, and a dancer and a footballer or any other form of actor imitating something, is also part of the subconscious of architecture. And then the next book, which is the PhD in effect, tried to carry that kind of practice-based book, which had erudite essays by Peter Carl and Alex Dara and younger members of the office like Laura Evans, into a sister book, which would be an academic book, but very highly visually driven, where kind of erudite footnotes but also drawings have a kind of equivalence, and also my drawings that I'd made during the research process, at the scale of the city and at the scale of rooms, where the drawing is both a memory drawing, i.e. something that is made in reflection, but also something which is, in other cases, observational. And so the reading of a building can move back and forth from text to image. And another aspect of the research I was doing was involving my friend David Grandorge, a colleague at the CAS, in doing a photographic survey of Victoria Street, where we were working, and comparing and contrasting it to Piccadilly, which was, much closer to the surface of the psyche of inhabitants and visitors to London as a place of beauty, attempting to reveal the hinterland of Victoria Street, which is much more interesting than the monolithic foreground of modernist buildings that we were looking to replace, and our proposals might suggest a kind of connection between the hinterland of the memory of the city and its foreground, if you will. Some of this work culminated in the Venice Biennale in 2012, and at the conclusion of the book, Civic Ground kind of has this sense that architecture is a setting not only for life but for artworks, and the collaboration between individuals and the latent capacity for a space to be completed in use, but also in a ceremonial sense, is really at the heart of the relationship between architecture's sculpture and site. And in some ways, as an attempt to try to describe a spatial condition, which is a sort of radical vulnerability, something where there's just enough architecture to allow people to understand the relationships between a town hall, an artwork, a residential building, and the other drawings from a public library, but also enough distance and enough space to allow them to be occupied. And there's a long story which I won't bore you with about how initially we were to make an academic journal, and in this period, just kind of 2016, 17, the effects of austerity upon British universities was beginning to really eat into the capacity of libraries to buy books and for new journals to be launched, because of the lack of money of librarians, and so a kind of business model where a university press would be a refereed journal was one way forwards. For various reasons, this didn't happen, and I was having made a series of proposals and got a series of a kind of broader network of friends and colleagues interested in contributing, faced with either kind of looking like a bit of an idiot or accepting that I needed to pay for this myself. And there's an interesting loophole in English tax law where the kind of two benefits of running an architecture practice seem to me to be you can buy as many books as you want, and that's seen as a form of research, and B, you can spend money on research, and that means publishing things which can be other people's work as much as your own. And when I began to think about what a magazine might be like, I was very strongly influenced by an architect called Luigi Moretti, who was the editor of a magazine called Spazio. And of course, there's a whole tradition in Italy of people like Vittorio Gorgotti and Ernesto Rogers being publishers and practitioners and also teachers. And in the UK, when David Chipperfield first started his practice, the 9H Gallery kind of occupied part of the studio space, and it produced a journal published intermittently with a very interesting editorial board, including Wilfred Wang and Jose Pallados Santos and Ros Diamond and people like that. And they were taking a similar view, which I presume is just sort of like most things in life, you kind of absorb stuff without really processing it at the time, where, you know, somebody's saying the ancient and modern in the architecture of Fernando Tavora, and this is the tennis court I was talking about in the Quinta de Conceição in Matosinhos. And I remember seeing this image of this photograph of the not yet complete house by Eduardo Souto de Moura, something completely archaic, the ancient stone walls in the garden, and the completely modern juxtaposed in a way that gave me such a thrill that it really didn't matter that the teachers who didn't get me and who I didn't get, they certainly didn't know about these guys, and I didn't feel so alone. It felt very important. If I was going to make a magazine, that I would try and find a way to create a home for things that were out of the mainstream, not part of necessarily a kind of an establishment. And this is the very famous 9H on continuity, very, very beautiful. The one before, but the first time Herzog de Meuron were published outside of Switzerland, and this one has O'Donnell and Toomey. It brilliantly visually driven. These are the photographs taken on Sigurd Lemrentz's honeymoon that weren't developed until they were discovered in his collection after he died, and yet somebody makes the proposal that the way he was photographing the ruins of Rome directly inspired his visual language in the juxtaposition of fragments of historical references and sculptures within the kind of field condition of his buildings. And the brilliant Hans Dolgast and his Arte Pinoteque quasi-reconstruction kind of collage approach to rebuilding things. This is 1995. There's kind of stories that people were, you know, putting forward Alvaro Siza for the gold medal at this point, and various British high-tech architects were saying, Alvaro Siza, who's he? And it felt that within kind of mainstream media, there was a kind of a sort of nationalistic project in the UK about the promotion of this high-tech style that was the inheritor of Paxton's great exhibition, the kind of national identity of architecture being a form of engineering. I'm obviously missing out on the wonders of Chambers and Hawksmoor and Wren and all the wonderful architects who weren't of that ilk. These guys were bringing to our attention, this is Peter Meckley's Camellia Art Gallery for the first time. And I think that when we were exposed to some of these people in 2012, and Kieran Long and Shumi Bose and David Chipperfield published this book, they were deliberately attempting to create a kind of underground network. I mean, obviously these figures are not 2012; they're no longer in the underground. But it meant that I kind of suddenly had contact with Shinozuki and who's a very brilliant architect in Milan and teacher at Politecnico, and Peter Meckley, people in his office, and even Maneo. So I kind of just wrote to everybody in my notebook, as it were, and said, look, we're thinking of making a journal. Send me anything that you can't get published that's not for the ref and is in a sock drawer and specifically has to do with doubt and reflection. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the process of making a magazine now, when you're designing a magazine. So Emma Kalkoven, who designed Civic Ground, had lost her job because Artifice and Black Dog had gone out of business. So this is the kind of crisis of publishing I was alluding to. It was partly a crisis of universities not being able to buy books anymore for their libraries. And she was occupying a desk in our office, and I was giving her work to do because she didn't really have a lot to do. And we started to think about what a magazine would look like. And there's this incredible pleasure, obviously, of typography. And this was a journal that she admires a lot called the Cambridge Literary Review, where the kind of equivalence between text and image is very delicately balanced. And these are early studies that she made for the cover, and very quickly she had the idea that there would be a two-tone colour juxtaposed over a monochrome image, and that they would form a series, and that it would look a bit like this. The same typeface that we used for Civic Ground would be used again. We now have this, which is a kind of hopefully from a foolproof guide to how to send us stuff. So if you want to contribute to the Joker, don't be shy. It's rolling. There's a kind of word of mouth thing where people want to be part of it. You can find this on the website. It's quite straightforward. Don't send us PDFs, send us Word documents. If you want to have footnotes, have footnotes. If you don't want to have footnotes, don't. If you want to send us poetry, do. If you want to send us fiction, do. There's no hierarchy here between the visual and the literary. We realised we needed a website about a few days before the launch of the first one, because Emma had invented a name for the website and we hadn't commissioned one. So we got Joseph Kohlmeyer, a friend and colleague from the CAS, who runs a very brilliant graphic studio called Polymekanos, to very quickly make us a website. You can now, because the issue 1 is sold out, get a digital version of the magazine as well. So for a tenner, you get a print version, a digital version. You can't get issue 1 anymore because there's none left, but you can get a digital version for £5. And it kind of looks like we're into this world now. And then the other kind of aspect of starting a magazine, I'm sort of talking to you a bit about the nuts and bolts, I guess, of this is that you need to think where you're going to have a launch, and the obvious place to do it is the AA bookshop, because they've got a huge network of ex-students and members and ex-staff, and it's a nice place to go, and it was a very convivial atmosphere. And this is the first one, and that's Joseph Rickver on the left, who was one of my PhD supervisors, Andrew Crompton, who was my boss at the time, who was the head of School of Architecture at Liverpool, and a young London architect called Michael Badu, who was also a contributor to the journal. I'm going to talk a bit about the journal in a second. And when you have launches at the AA, it's quite formal. There's this table, and nobody can drink whilst you're talking, and it gets stuffy, and it's very convivial, but it's also a bit institutional. And as we've gone on, we've now started to use other situations. So this is a pavilion that we designed and built last year for our landlord in the courtyard of our office building in Hackney. And this is a poet giving a reading. So the kind of structure of the events were, I think in this case, actually, we didn't even bother having a chat. David Randorge, in fact, just DJ'd. So it's somewhere between a club night, an academic seminar, and a poetry reading, which is a really nice convivial event. I keep using the word convivial, I don't know why. And of course, it's too cold at Christmas to do these things. So we migrated to the Philip Gallery in Hoxton. This is Blaise Luxembourg, a colleague and good friend. And on her left is Peter Finnemore, a contributor to the last edition and an exhibition of his work. So this is kind of expanded world of friends from the art world who are, in Peter's case, photographing spatial conditions. Works as a reader in urban aesthetics at the Royal College of Art. So it's kind of academic work merging with events. And this is issue one of the Joker. And I'm gonna talk a bit about this, and then I'm gonna try and stop talking in about 15 minutes. So you can ask me if you want what I've not told you. So the cover has a photograph of the open lobby or foyer of the Palace Cinema in Galway by my good friend Tom Dupois, the Dublin architect. And it's not a photograph of an object, it's a photograph of a space where the city and the atmosphere, the rain of the city falls straight through the ticket desk and places, if you like, architecture into its civic setting. And so the Joker, which is the Journal of Civic Architecture, kind of operates, if you like, between the city and the room, and between the very highbrow, i.e. the Journal of Civic Architecture, and something which is pop culture. The list of contributors, I've mentioned some of them. Johan Selsing, very brilliant Swedish architect, had written a piece that wasn't published. I came to know about because at the time Douglas Murphy, who you may know as the author of some very excellent books about Boris Johnson and a teacher at the Royal College in St Martin's, was working in the practice and writing for Icon, and he showed me this piece by Johan that I thought was wonderful. Indra Kargis McEwen is a very brilliant, I suppose she's a historian of architecture, the student of Alberto Perez Gomez in McGill, working between archaeology, theatre studies, anthropology and architecture. One of my heroes, and I got to meet her, and she proposed to write something about Brezhnev, one of my other heroes. So it's this kind of, wow, what do you want to do? I want to do this. Marvelous. Simon Walker, another Irish architect, something I used to teach with at UCT, writing about his father. We collaborated on an exhibition for the Venice Biennale in the Irish Pavilion in 2008 about the relationship between Seamus Heaney's poetry written in and about Walker's architecture. And Laura Evans, I mentioned earlier, who was working in the office at the time, Joseph Rigver, who was my teacher, and Chino and Louisa, who had exhibited our work at Milan Triennale, and I got to know Chino through the Venice Biennale. Andrew Compton, I mentioned, Michael Maddow, I mentioned, and Geraldine Clarkson, who I met, like a lot of people, on the internet, if you know what I mean. And this is an image inside Tom's cinema. The editorial letter kind of sets the scene, I think, for what we're trying to do, which is deal with a kind of developed subjectivity, i.e. that rather than trying artificially to impose thematic content on architecture, what I'm interested in is how, as in a conversation in the bar, or via email or other forms of social media, you can reach an understanding about what you're doing retrospectively, and when you do realise what you're doing, it becomes very interesting to thematise it and to problematise it. And so the obvious thing to say about the first issue is it had to do with portraiture, and so Tom's house or farmstead project that he's completing now was the beginning of the Joker, and he is writing somewhere between poetry, documentary observation, and prose. And so deliberately there's a juxtaposition between text and imagery of ancient things and half-built things. And then I realised that it would be interesting. I thought that if I had a conversation with Tom, we could kind of draw out some of the things that we'd kind of forgotten when we were drunk talking about them. And I realised that rather than, I'd been interviewed quite a lot, and normally somebody kind of sits with you and they put a machine in front of you and you talk for an hour and you don't remember what you said, or you say things that you regret. But the power of email means that you can actually, you can think about something for a few days and you can delete it. And strangely, there's a more intimate form of discourse. It's not quite writing letters back and forth as in the world of Jane Austen novels. And it's not quite the world of normal people and people texting, but it's a record nonetheless of a kind of digital intimacy. And Emma Kalkoven's a very, very brilliant graphic designer, and unusually she actually reads the text. Her father's an architect, her husband's an architect, and her brother's an architect, and she therefore is kind of able, I think, very brilliantly to juxtapose image and text. And it kind of occurred to me that there was if you can quite see it on the right of the screen, that scene from across the water. Tom's cinema had a very strong resemblance to Aldo Rossi's floating theatre that was used for the Venice Biennale, and I was kind of intrigued by this a talk he gave in London in I think 2017, and so the conversation was really about the world of archetypes, the world of memory, and how you teach, and can you teach that? How drawings give you access to a visual language which is kind of beyond the grasp of reason or logic, but has a kind of dream logic that is palpable. And Johann's text is more polemic. It's effectively an argument for decorum and appropriateness and the ethical aspects of aesthetics. This is his building in the Woodland Cemetery in Stockholm, and he juxtaposes this with some work by Lacatin and Vassal, which is very different aesthetically, but in each case, the extension to the housing scheme and the cafe, an elaboration on the situatedness of the design task. And then this essay by Indra, it's deliberately juxtaposed by photographs by her friend Jeffrey James, where the text is written in response to the photographs, and because they're visiting the graveyard together, the conversation is back and forth between drawing and observation and record and document and writing. And this is the sadly now demolished Board Fulcher Irish tourist board in Dublin on the canal at the end of Bagot Street, and Simon's juxtaposition of his father's writings and Miss Slenderara's writings, who his father had worked for, and Laura's work in Cuba, looking at the legacy of some Italian architects working under the communist regime, very low energy, kind of proto-ecological vernacular, very beautiful buildings, misunderstood by the imposition of concrete plant technology by Stalin on the situation. Sorry, not Stalin. I think it was Brezhnev. I can't remember. Sorry. And then a project by Joseph Whitworth, who we know as a historian, but actually Joseph was a practicing architect. This is his competition entry for Liverpool Cathedral. At the launch, I pointed out that it had a remarkable similarity to a wimple, you know, the big starched hats that Belgian nuns wear. Joseph doesn't like that reading whatsoever. This is Chino and Louise's essay about the tension between architecture as something which is theoretical and something which is a craft. Andrew Crompton's a very interesting writer. He's initially trained as a scientist at Cambridge and as an architect in Manchester, and he's kind of interested in the subconscious, the strange imagination of certain architects working in between modernism and the kind of dominance of kind of the modernist art history reading of 20th century work. And then Michael's essay is a kind of autobiographical portrait of his experiences growing up as a Catholic in London, being a convert to Islam, and then designing religious spaces, often in very kind of conventional formats. But the kind of feminist critique that he was able to bring to bear on the relationship between women and men's prayer spaces inside the building. What I'm trying to do in this is not make any visual judgments in terms of style, because I think that is what the establishment does via universities, publishing houses, via Pevsner's really quite dismissive comments about some very brilliant architects in the 20th century who didn't fit with his ideology of modernism as technology, and also the magazines which seem to have a kind of ideological force field around them of wanting to promote a certain idea about what the future is. And now that the magazine is quite successful, it's taken by magazine shops, fashion shops, skateboard shops. There's a whole kind of subculture of people who just love magazines in the way in which people love music, and they love the whole aesthetic of a record label. So when I was growing up, you would basically, if you liked Joy Division, you would just buy, everything that Factory Records did. If you liked Prefab Sprout, you would buy everything that Kitchenware Records would produce. If you liked the Cocteau Twins, you would buy everything that 4AD produced. There was a kind of back and forward between the visual aesthetic of the fashion that the guys and girls in the bands were wearing. They were obviously touring with each other, the record sleeves. And this is an advert for London Review of Books, which I think is the closest we have to a kind of extremely readable, very, very highbrow, but also very pleasurable form of popular literary culture. We then found ourselves making books. David Grandorge, as I mentioned, and then belatedly John Mounier. And David was kind of, I think, finding himself sort of caught between the world of kind of geography and academic publishing, saying it wasn't scientific enough, and the world of art photography saying, you actually care about the human environment. And so the second issue of the Joker coincided with a book launch. I'm just going to conclude with some pictures of this stuff. Still Beautiful it is a project also that it takes this, I suppose, kind of what was an evolving CAS aesthetic over the past 20 years or so. This is a photo of the lobby of Tony Garnier's Opera House and a modernist workshop, and by juxtaposing them, forcing you to, in some ways, put into abeyance your art historical reading and to instead focus on the beauty of both of these things and their differences and their similarities. And the book came out of an experience David had when he went to the Arctic to photograph some buildings by Brezhnev and Christopherson, and came in on the mail plane, took the photos, stayed for a few days, got into conversations with some scientists there, and started to realise that what they were talking about is what we now know as ice melt. And so the project then led him to, this is the border of Russia and the Baltic states, Lithuania, I believe, looking into the kind of landscape that is the result of fossil fuel technology and its effect upon the natural world, and the extreme juxtaposition between modern architecture and topography. And it's partly nature photography and partly documentation. And this is the Dead Sea. So what David kind of belatedly realised he had a project here where he wasn't just doing the picturesque, he was actually photographing the damage that the human species was, the Anthropocene, I guess, having. And this is the one effect of the refugee crisis coming from American foreign policy in the Arab states was that the building of refugee camps was leading to a depletion in the water level in the Dead Sea. The creation of concrete was revealing the salt flats, and so it's something that kind of moves between kind of worldliness and acceptance of the role of, or the interrelationship of the roles of technology, geography, geopolitics, landscape, and also aesthetics. And this is a conversation with a very old friend of mine, David Campany, who's a kind of world-leading critic in in photography, had written about architectural photography and David's own work. And then the last thing we've made is a book about the architect John Mounier. You may know of the Burrell collection in Glasgow. A number of architects in the UK have been trying to stop Glasgow City Council from, in our view, damaging the building. And I got to know John through this campaign, with Richard Waite and some other journalists at the AJ, and we developed a conversation that became part of the Joker. And I realised there was much more to be said, and that John had always taught. He'd been he studied at Liverpool, worked for Marcel Breuer, met an American woman, then did a master's at Harvard, worked in Munich with people in the world of Hans Dolgas orbit at what is now TU Munich, and then got a job at Cambridge and was teaching and building and writing, and so the book is a kind of it's not a monograph, and it's not a study that you do when somebody's dead. It's a conversation, and it's both kind of me writing about the effect the work has on me and what I think is important, the lessons it has for us today, and John's own work, which weirdly has this same aesthetic of juxtaposition of Renaissance architecture and modern architecture, and the theme that he identifies as intricacy that runs between them. So we're not classifying things in terms of style or in terms of individual genius or ideology. We're looking instead at thematic continuity, and that is a kind of visual aesthetic for the book as well, where original competition drawings juxtaposing the stained glass in the Burrell's collection and the landscape of Pollock Park, and more conventional orthographic representation, and then original photography and more recent photography by Tom Lee. And this juxtaposition of stained glass artifacts from ruined medieval monasteries and modern architecture, and this kind of strange dreamlike character to a gable facade, and original photography and more recent commission work. This is just kind of tectonic details of how the plinth of the building, which responds to the rolling state of the ground, isn't insulated at the plinth level and becomes insulated, and that gives you this deliberately exaggerated like cantilever and horizon of human occupation, looking out onto the the valley and the church below. This is one of David's photographs of having lunch with John. So this is highly refined architectural world and the world of human occupation. And at the end, John's scooter from his road trip at the end of his year out with Marcel Breuer, kind of 2,000-year-old tree and a state-of-the-art Vespa. The project's kind of snowballing, and we're now doing a series of very hopefully cheap and popular paperbacks. Will Jennings, a very brilliant young artist and writer whose work oscillates between writing as an artistic practice and photography. This guy Patrick Lynch, who fucking chuff about himself. This is effectively a collection of essays. I retrospectively realised that I'd interviewed Zumta for the AJ when I had a column there, and Ritvert and Vesely and Maneo for my PhD, and then people that have appeared in The Joker. Oscar Maldo in the office, who thinks he's funny, he's quite funny, thinks that really it should be called the Journal of Civic Architecture and Psychoanalysis, and really what the project is about is dialogue and conversation and bringing to the surface things that people don't really feel comfortable about talking about. By which I mean, if you think about a lot of what you do as an architect is self-promotion and trying to get work, and it's not that you're telling lies. It's just that there's a very curated and crafted persona that results from working with PR people, and then there's academic work which is seeking a kind of objectivity that you find in the social sciences. And then there's the work of the writings by architects like Alvaro Siza and figures who just seem to be able to open up a vein and let it go. And it's that I'm really interested in. As a young guy, I really liked reading the lyrics of songs. I found that was as interesting as dancing to it, and that you can switch between physical reaction to something and then where your mind is reacting to the words. And sometimes they come together and sometimes they don't, but it doesn't really matter, because it's not necessary to know everything about everything. They're all glimpses into something I think that we have in common, and that is the imagination, and it appears to us differently at different rates. Okay, I'm going to stop now. I think I'm just about hit the mark that I...
Thank you, Patrick. Fantastic. Could you yeah, perfect. Unsharing the screen. I mean, I think it's such an impressive achievement, the work you showed, and I'm particularly sympathetic to this interest in making conjunctions of words and images. And I've always had a frustration with the way architectural publishing has increasingly become that you go to have meetings with publishers and they understand a book which is 100 dog kennels of the world, or a high concept sort of picture book, and they understand a book where Rowan was writing 100,000 words and there were kind of 10 images maybe in the middle. But between these two poles, there's a sort of expectation that nothing at all, can sell. And I'm certainly very conscious that the books that I first got engaged with when I was discovering about architecture, the books that first engaged me in architecture, were generally of this kind. That they were often transcribed lectures, actually, where the words and the text were. The words and the images were working kind of in tandem, and I guess I'm thinking of Complexity and Contradiction in Architectures like that. Charles Jenks's books are like that. The Summerson Language of Classical Architecture, or I think later books like Maneo's books of lectures from Harvard, and I guess just. Further to that, one of the exciting things about the last month, really, for me, has been, with Rosie and I putting on this talks program and seeing people explore the potential of this format to speak to images. And like Samuel Lundberg's had a whole series of fantastic talks that he's been putting together, where he's talking to images in his Instagram feed, often at a level of detail that you would never be able to get to if you didn't have the image there, because you wouldn't, frankly, have the vocabulary to describe the way that 3 bits of stone are coming together in a facade. Sorry, this isn't so much a question, but it's a statement of solidarity. But we do have questions, and we've got 10 minutes to go. So I'm going to open the mic to some other people. The first of whom is Adam Jones. Adam, over to you. Oh, are you there? Can you hear? Sorry. Adam, stop trying to unmute yourself, and I will unmute you. No? It's not working. I'm going to have to read it, I'm afraid. Sorry, I don't have a that's why. Sorry, I don't have a microphone to ask directly. Hi, Patrick. I love the Joker, and we all know that academic research, writing, and publication enriches our collective thinking and knowledge within the profession. But do you think academic writing, research, and publications can reach an audience beyond architects and have a wider impact? Ultimately, can it improve the quality of the built environment?
Yeah, I'm quite romantic, I think, in that I really do think that buildings are books are as good as buildings, and that good buildings are exemplary, and that's why they get into books and why they become part of the collective unconscious of architecture as a discipline. But it's obviously not causal when it's not direct. There are all sorts of pressures that universities are under. The lack of funding for architectural education from the government, the way in which funding is given out via research is I think, distorting not only the character of architecture schools and the people in them, but also the type of work that people are doing. They're seeking research funding. Yeah, it's a strange moment, and I think that there is this kind of space. I disagree with Peter Eisman about almost everything, but when he didn't get tenure at Princeton, and he started the Institute of Urbanism in New York and got Philip Johnson, another kind of extremely difficult character, to fund publications, and he got Ada Rossi's Architecture of the City translated and wrote actually a very good introduction to it. And I think that was a deliberate attempt to try to put ideas out there, and I think that academia is constraining in some ways when the disconnect between education and public knowledge and training and the social values of architecture are just not represented by governments that don't really value practical wisdom. That was the title of the PhD seminar at the CAS that I was involved in, Peter Carl's use of Aristotle's term to distinguish between artistic knowledge, which is self-generated purely for oneself, arguably, and scientific knowledge and technical knowledge. There has always been this tradition, though, within architecture of us being kind of academics and kind of, was it somebody described Palladio as being basically a builder with just enough Latin. So I think there is a kind of, there's always been a concerted effort to get ideas out there. The London Review of Books is interesting because most of the people that write for that are have tenured chairs at universities, but their public discourse is via this thing that is basically a kind of broadsheet. It's disposable. Umberto Eco was a correspondent for a newspaper. I just don't really get this hierarchy between highbrow stuff and lowbrow stuff, and I just think it's just silly. It's not what it's not how the world works. It's not how people think. So that's a rambling response.
Next up, we've got Rebecca Galbraith. I'm going to unmute you, Rebecca.
Hello there. Hi. I know, Patrick, you've got a real passion for drawing as well. Will there be drawings in future issues? Do you have that to look forward to?
Yeah, that's something that didn't sort of bed in the first issue. I showed the cover of that's coming up. It is ostensibly under the theme of work, but really is about how architects work. And Birkin Howard, who I've interviewed at length, and who you may know was one of the first four employees at Foster's, then was in practice with Joe Van Henigen, and 10 years ago gave up practice and is now a painter. So it's very explicitly about drawing. Yes.
Next up, we have Dominic Ely. Hello, Dominic. Over to you.
Hey, Dom.
Hi, Patrick. How are you?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
Very well, thank you. It was mainly about the Mounier book, which I think's incredibly interesting. I think it almost kind of creates a new typology of book in a way. I found it very fascinating in that, you know, it collects long form essays. It almost felt like an extension of the Joker magazine, but with long form. I was just wondering how you went about kind of curating, organizing that. What was your thoughts behind the organization of the text and the images within it?
I think it was largely when you do graduate work. I'm not talking about kind of MArch stuff, but MPhil and PhD. A lot of the process of training is bibliographies and organising knowledge. There's a kind of most PhDs are literature surveys. So I was very conscious that what I was hoping to create was the primer for people to hopefully write masters or PhDs of John's work. So there was that aspect of it, of kind of collation, but also having taught quite a lot for a number of years and taught kind of history and theory as well as design. But it's the sort of thing you notice at a certain point, which is really, really, you know, you've done a lot of work and you expect people to tell you that it's all great. And at a certain point, they'll just say, "What's your thinking? You know, what's the big idea?" And I was taught like that as you were at Liverpool, that there was a thesis project and that you wrote down what you were doing and you constantly referred back and forth to it. And that's something I tried to do in a unit system at CAS, was somewhere between a self-generated project and group work. And so what became clear was that John kept using intricacy. And I just challenged him and said, "Well, what does that mean? And can you give me some historical architect?" And it turned out, yes, he had, and he'd been thinking about it over a 50-year teaching career. And then he realized what it meant also to him was collaboration, and collaboration with a client gives you intricacy that can't necessarily come from oneself. And so he wrote the essay about Mr. Schroeder and Gerrit Rietveld. And so being an editor is a bit like being a teacher, but it's sort of, I guess, what Oscar's sketch, it's a bit like being a therapist. You're sort of getting people to say what they believe in. And it's quite hard for architects because we tend to use language in a very scattergun way. And that's kind of amusing down the pub, obviously, but books aren't like that. But then books which are too polemical, in my view, where they're kind of straining to demonstrate something and every image kind of like a nail being hammered into the argument, aren't necessarily real reflections of how architects think. So it was very much about trying to get his voice down. But it was also what I realised that doing the interview in the Joker was that it's a dialogue culture. It's not something that you do on your own. And you know, one effect of art history writing on architecture, especially writing about modernism, is you get this idea that somehow architects kind of, oh, we've got an ideology and we need to do that now. And you get people like Schumacher going, yeah, I need to find a new aesthetic for the 21st century based on my ideology, and I'm going to write a book, and everybody's going to be convinced, and they're suddenly going to start doing parametricism. And that you can sort of do that. You can apply that to people when they're dead because they can't answer back. But when they're alive, you have to engage in dialogue with them, and how you sort of craft that. And so in effect, it's effectively kind of one training for a PhD is you kind of give lectures. One is that you can supervise dissertations. One is that you can write books yourself. But what I realise another part of it is that you can be quite that there's a sort of public service of getting stuff down in a format that hopefully is enjoyable, but also has layers within it, so that if you want to, if you feel inspired by parts of it, you can pick up the thread and take it further, and the dialogue continues. And that it really is what I think the history of architecture is. It's not a kind of a canon that exists of people that were popular in their age or powerful, you know, or the most convincing. It's something that people fall in love with, you know, just as you do when you're a student. You find somebody forgotten who is really important to you and moves you, and you want to find more. And John, the Burwell collection, I just thought was the most amazing building when I first visited it. And then having the chance to know the man, and when it was finally finished and published, he and Barry Gasson had their relationship had broken down as practitioners and as friends. And John had left the country and taken up a position in America at a university. And when it was published, it was kind of Barry's project, but just getting him to tell the story about, you know, they were lecturers in Cambridge. Their students the drawings were by various students, and I was kind of talking to various students who were there when they beat Dennis Lasden, came second, and they had a party to celebrate that. And there's John's like, you know, giving the students, you know, £5 to go and buy some bottles of beer from the pub across the road. And it was the students drawing in their spare time and their lecturers making this thing. And that in itself was a story that I felt was, you know, polemically very important to say as a counter to the situation that we now find ourselves in. And part of the shame of the destruction of the world that the CAS was that, you know, Florian and Phil were running their studio with their students and ex-students. You know, they were kind of in between working on buildings in Korea and coming into tutorials and coming back and forth for lectures. There was this, you know, architectural research, you know, back and forth of drawing and sketching and making books and talking, a very beautiful conversation. And I suppose it's I'm nostalgic for that, and I think it's worth preserving and fighting for. Yeah, it's a civic function of architecture. It's not just making buildings.